As a spiritual counselor, I'm left with the difficult task of trying to put words to communicate with people the ineffable. Because, at its base, spirituality is not something that can be prescribed or something that can be contained by definitions. However, if we want to try to talk about spirituality, we have to do our best to point people towards the ineffable, towards that which can't be said, so that they can draw on their own experiences to touch spirituality and have an understanding of what it means. So one notion that for me was a very deep one, that is an entrance into a conversation about, an entrance into the reality of spirituality, is the notion of an archetype. Carl Jung is credited with the notion of an archetype from a psychological point of view. And if we're just kind of sketch the edges, pun intended, an archetype is actually similar to something like a stereotype or typology of some kind. An archetype in the psychological sense is a deep psychological structure embedded in the unconscious of all human beings. If you think about like Plato, one of his ideas was the realm of ideal forms, long before Carl Jung. The realm of ideal forms said that for every phenomenon, everything that exists in the world, there is a perfect archetype or stereotype of it that exists in the realm of the imaginary, let's call it, or in the realm of the idea. And that all things in this world are imperfect versions of that perfect archetypal ideal of that thing. So an easy example a lot of philosophy teachers use is a chair. That, let's call it in heaven, in the realm of ideal imaginary forms, there's a perfect chair. And every chair here is a reflection of that chair, of that idea chair. So an archetype is like that. An archetype could be a force. The way that I like to think about archetypes in a practical way is as like a personality inside of myself. So when I'm doing my own transformational work or I'm working with someone else, what I'll notice if I'm moving slow enough and really paying attention is that it'll feel like there's more than one person inside of a person. I'll call those sub-personalities. And if you really move in deeply to sub-personalities, you'll see there's like certain commonalities that different people's sub-personalities have. So here's an easy example. What is the archetype of the addict? Right? The addict is a phenomenon. I know one when I meet one, you know what I mean? But what is the ideal form that all humans are, dancing around, imperfect versions of that perfect addict? And I'm going to give you an example. If you watch the movie Lord of the Rings, there's a Gollum character in there. And he goes, precious. And he's addicted to this ring. He's this kind of skinny little gray dope fiend. And he's kind of sweet, but not really trustworthy because he's so infatuated with getting this ring. And to me, when you look at that guy, you go, that is the archetype of the addict. And if you're an addict and you look inside yourself, you can go, I recognize that inner precious in me. So you can think about archetypes as these kind of ideal forms that we all somehow kind of relate to. So it's the archetype of the drunk or the archetype of the addict, or when I sat and put the sweater on, a few people here said, okay, professor, it's like, okay, the archetype of a professor. And so there are these things that, can't be defined, but that we recognize them when we see them, and they're sort of embedded in our consciousness. And it's not always people or sub-personalities and that kind of thing. A lot of the time, we talk about archetypal forces in the unconscious, which is the same kind of idea, but imagine that there are, in the structures of our mind, archetypes at different levels. And like up here, we have things like personalities, but down here, there are things like drives, these archetypal, primitive drives that exist and things like that. And so what does that have to do with spirituality? Well, I think that what people don't understand is that one level of spirituality is the level of the imaginary. If you close your eyes and kind of move into your inner world and landscape, there are words, poetry, language, sensations, colors, images, beings even sometimes, at least in your dreams, entities. There's a whole world and realm of the imaginary that's, possibly, if we speculate, being produced by our mind, or maybe we're tapping in, to something collective, or we're tapping into the cosmos. But spirituality connects in that, part of spirituality connects in that place of the imaginary, or in that place of the psyche. And so getting to know these different forces within me, these different archetypes within me, the different shapes and contours of my psyche is part of my spiritual work. Alan Watts says about Carl Jung that one of the things that's so impressive about him is how well he knew himself, and particularly how well he knew his shadow. He's one of those men who became very comfortable with all of his different parts. And one could say that the act of maturity, and definitely spiritual maturity, has to do with becoming more and more comfortable with all the parts of yourself, in particular, the parts of yourself that make you uncomfortable.